three young hikers were trapped on a shale cliff, trying to hold on until help could arrive as the rocks beneath their feet began to give way. When last heard from, paramedic Dale Carl had been in an ambulance on the way to the hospital, treating his 64-year-old father for an apparent heart attack. Dale's wife, Marie, waited at the hospital, unaware that his ambulance had been involved in a serious accident. While King County police officers waited outside the apartment door, inside, a despondent man with a shotgun was threatening to kill himself. 911 dispatcher John Meany had been on the phone with the man for almost 15 minutes, trying to persuade him to come out without hurting anybody.
I want you to talk to my guys at the door.
Fine. Can I keep the shotgun in my hand just for a little bit of security?
Well, security for what?
For myself.
As the minutes passed, John Meany continued to try to persuade the caller that suicide was not the answer to his troubles, and that he didn't want to risk hurting anybody. 911 dispatcher John Darnell had been on the phone with Danielle Ingersoll long enough to learn she thought she'd been bitten by something. But as Danielle began slowly losing consciousness, she mistakenly hung up the phone. It had been approximately 3 minutes since the shotgun exploded, sending metal ripping through 17-year-old Jeff McCloskey's arm. While those at the scene fought to save Jeff's life, Jackie Gish ran to the nearest road to help guide the medic unit to her house.
I was really scared when I was waiting that they'd come too late and it wouldn't be time enough for Jeff to live. And that's when it really hit me that I might lose this guy who, for a time he was kind of like my brother.
It was a difficult rural address to find. There were several driveways in close proximity, and they were not well marked. We were met by somebody out at the end of the driveway who looked quite frantic, and that was the first indication that we had a serious injury taking place.
On August 15th, 1990, members of the Phoenix Fire Department's Swiftwater Rescue Team were called to the scene of a flash flood where a truck was being washed away with an elderly couple trapped inside. When Wayne Shoup was thrown from the carriage he was driving, his friend Colleen Fry watched in horror as the horse dragged Wayne a quarter-mile down the road and into the woods. When 17-year-old Chrissy fell 100 feet down a sheer rock wall, 14-year-old Shanti had to find help. She was the only one who knew where her friend lay injured at the bottom of treacherous Box Canyon. When 16-year-old Katie Martin seemed to be suffering a severe asthma attack, her friends rushed to get her to the nearest police station before she could no longer breathe at all. When 12-year-old Clint Campos suffered an asthma attack late one night, he collapsed and stopped breathing. His parents did not know first aid. 911 dispatcher Danette D'Amato was their only hope for saving Clint's life. When 2.5-year-old Ross Copestick was pulled from the shallow pond at the resort where his family had been vacationing, he was not breathing. There seemed little chance that his life would be saved. When the racing sailboat Guy Atkins was on capsized, his leg got caught in the steel cables that support the mast. Despite the efforts of his friends and others who came to help, as the boat slowly sank, it dragged him below the surface of the water. It had been nearly 5 minutes since 69-year-old Joanne Benjamin suffered a heart attack while scuba diving. Her husband, Walter, could only watch helplessly as Lori McLaughlin performed CPR, and other divers in the area joined in the effort to save his wife's life.
Hey, what can I do?
We need oxygen.
Okay, hang on.
Got it. Hurry.
My brother Joe and I climbed in the boat immediately.
A crash had left 17-year-old Kim Potts pinned in the wreckage of her burning vehicle. Several passing motorists who'd stopped to help desperately worked to free her, but they couldn't pull her legs out from under the crushed steering wheel. After being repeatedly stabbed in a violent attack, the 20-year-old victim, Rebecca, had managed to make her way to an empty farmhouse and call for help. But without the aid of an enhanced 911 system, dispatchers were afraid they would not be able to locate the isolated house before Rebecca bled to death. Following a high-speed chase, Marion County Sheriff's deputies successfully captured a suspect wanted in a house robbery. But during the chase, a second suspect, possibly armed, had leaped from the moving car and disappeared into the surrounding neighborhood. When the lines of Steve Kivett's parachutes became entangled during a practice stunt dive, it became impossible for him to cut away a small chute and open his main one. Steve was hurtling towards the ground, out of control, at more than 50 miles an hour. As 911 dispatcher Deanna Wells was trying to convince a woman not to follow through on her threat to commit suicide, the woman suddenly hung up. Concerned about what might have happened, Deanna immediately called her back. Kathy Banks had been on the phone with paramedic Craig Cusinelli for almost 10 minutes, trying to breathe life into the baby born without a pulse or a heartbeat, and help was still 30 miles away. "49-year-old Bert Huffman had suffered a massive heart attack during the reenactment of a Civil War battle. Friends and rescue workers who happened to be on the scene administered CPR while waiting for an ambulance to arrive from more than 10 miles away. It had taken weeks for the Spauldings to find anyone who'd help them with their snake problem. The day after their scout trip, Todd and Tom returned with reinforcements, snake hunters Joe Wazalewski and Felix Velez. During a shootout with a man on a remote road in the desert, the arresting officer, Wade Liskey, was seriously wounded. Without any first aid equipment to treat him, there was little his friend and fellow officer, Sergeant Ken Jasperson, could do, except radio his dispatcher for help. Bruce Hines was just getting home from walking his dogs, unaware that two young boys had fallen through the icy surface of nearby Arapahoe Lake and were fighting for their lives. The police were on their way to the Hollingsworth home, but even 911 operator Valerie Nelson was confused as to what had actually happened inside the house. All they knew for certain was that someone had been shot. When 4-year-old Kimberly accidentally stabbed her little brother in the stomach with a knife, the responsibility for what to do rested with their 10-year-old sister, Michelle. As Dusty Wilson was rushing his pregnant wife, Jackie, to the hospital, she suddenly collapsed in the car. By the time Jackie arrived at the emergency room, under the care of Dr. Eddie Hooker, she was no longer breathing, and her heart had stopped beating. It had been less than 2 minutes since 911 dispatcher Dan Klein had received a call from a distraught 5-year-old Kimberly Crescent, reporting that her dad was hurt. It had been only minutes since Dee had last seen her 7-year-old sister Stacy, and even less time since Stacy's 6-year-old friend Joshua saw her kidnapped. But everyone knew if they didn't find the little girl soon, they might never see her again. Telephone researcher Carol Edwards had managed to convince her supervisor that she had heard a phone machine message with a suicide threat on it. But when the local 911 operator dialed the number, what she heard was an ordinary message. Dispatcher trainee Laurie Anderson had been on the job only 6 weeks when she received an unsettling 911 call. A woman named Margaret Fisher had said that a man was trying to break into the house. Seconds later, the line went dead. When Elaine Yadwin's husband fell unconscious at the controls of a small plane 6,000 feet above ground, she was forced to take over. But the fuel gauge was on empty, and Elaine did not even know how to switch over to the other tank. When logging company mechanics Ken Leppard and Ken Murdoch found a newborn baby abandoned by the side of the road, the tiny child was nearly frozen to death. The two men radioed a desperate call for help that was relayed immediately to 911.